Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the ASX and Sectors weekly chart analysis for the week ending 2nd of April 2026. First chart is the parent index of the Australian Stock Exchange. This is the XJO, the S&P ASX 200 index, and price made a modest recovery this week after testing for supply early. It tested for supply below the previous bar's close in there, then responded relatively positively and then faded lower towards the end of the week. You can see there's the breakdown line. So prices are attempting to consolidate in here. A little bit of strength was seen last week, and that was confirmed this week with a test for supply and a modest push higher. There was no serious challenge to this breakdown line in the background. Price moved up to it and then faded back down to trade just below it at the close of trade last week. Volume, while reduced, remained at the average level. So this was pretty good, strong activity for what was a shortened trading week. Just goes to show there is a lot going on at the moment. The market continues to be quite reactive to world events and overseas market trading. It's not really leading. It's not attempting to lead. It's reacting to what's going on as it happens. Next chart is the mid-cap sector, and very similar to the parent index. There was a little bit of strength seen last week. Breakdown line above is up here. Price tested for supply below the previous bar's close, responded higher, then faded lower to close about mid-bar on reduced but about average volume. Once again, pretty strong volume for what was a shortened trading week. There's a lot of room to move above if the market did want to move higher. I don't think it really wants to at this point in time. I think it wants to consolidate probably in here, in this zone in there. But it's going to be very reactive to overseas events and overseas market trading, at least in the near term. Small ordinaries sector, once again, very similar. Price found a little bit of strength last week, tested for supply early, below the previous bar's close, pushed up, faded down for the close of trade, breakdown line above, plenty of room to move above if it wants to, probably wants to consolidate in here like this. And it's also going to be very reactive to what's going on overseas markets, at least in the near term. This is the ASX financial sector. Bit of a shakeout this week. Perhaps not a perfect one, but it was a bit of a shakeout all the same. You've got the highs of the range up here and a longer term high through there. Price pulled back and recovered a month ago. Did a similar thing again this week. It did appear the market was going to gain some strength from this attempt to push higher. But with the world events at the moment causing issues across markets generally, this market perhaps not responded as expected. It's attempting to show strength, and you can see that volume was still at average on a shortened trading week, so the activity is quite high, but the market's very reactive at the moment, and it's not confident. It's tentative trading. There's a tentative attempt to support the market. And that's about all we're going to get at this point in time until things settle down a little bit. But there is still support in this market by the looks, at least for this sector. This is the largest sector by some way, the financials. But markets pulled back and it's recovered, closed almost adjacent to the previous bar's close, leaving a shakeout kind of a bar, although a shakeout in a tentative market doesn't ever show the amount of strength you would normally see if it was a shakeout in a stronger market. So we'll take that with a little grain of salt at this point in time, but it's certainly not particularly weak. It's tentatively strong. This is the metals and mining subsector, and volume in this market was actually above the average, which was surprising in a shortened trading week. You've got the breakdown line here The market saw some strength last week. There was no test for supply in this market. It just pushed higher and then faded lower and back to the important level, which is possibly what you will see generally across these markets. Perhaps with a test for supply more likely, but there was no test for supply this week. Prices closed at a logical level. It's in a good position to test for supply early next week if required, and then respond depending on how much supply is drawn out. Gold price futures. Gold price futures traded very similar to the metals and mining subsector, as you would expect to a large degree. Here's the breakdown line above. Some modest strength was seen last week. That allowed the market to push higher in response. There was no test for supply in this market either, and prices faded lower towards the end of the week on about average volume, which is still pretty strong for a shortened trading week. I would expect the market will test for supply within the range of the previous bar early in the week next week, and then respond depending on how much supply is drawn out. This is the energy sector, been very strong more recently and continues to look fairly strong. There was a test for supply early in the week below the previous bar's close. Price then pushed higher. There's only a modest fade lower on above average volume. It was reduced volume, but it remained above the average. So this market's seeing quite a lot of activity, and it's almost looking like it might be trading in some sort of bullish absorption pattern. We'll see how that goes. This market's certainly looking stronger than weaker, and the strongest of the markets we've looked at so far. This is the healthcare sector. Been a very turbulent market, to say the least, more recently. 3 weeks ago, we noted that despite this being a volatile market more recently, with price fading lower, appearing to find support, only to fail each time, there was an indication that some support had emerged on this bar. You can see on this increased volume. And since then, price has traded within that bar's range sideways in what you might term consolidation mode. We've seen this before in this market, so it's not too much to get excited about, but there's an attempt to support the market at this point in time. We'll see if that develops in the coming weeks, but at this point in time, there does appear a modest attempt to support this market. We'll see how that goes during the week. This is the ASX industrial sector, and similar to many of the other markets we've looked at so far, some modest strength was seen last week. A test for supply below the previous bar's close early in the week. Price pushed higher in response and then faded lower to close at mid-bar. You've got the breakdown line above, so there is some room to move above, but I think this market is attempting to consolidate sideways, trade in that sort of range there. And that's similar to many of the other markets we've looked at so far. This is consumer staples. It did push higher this week, often termed a defensive market. When there's turbulence around the world, this market is more prominent. It's traded more consistently. Highs of the range is through here. You've seen the market consolidating over the last few weeks. Price then responded positively this week following a test for supply, and it didn't really fade lower. It sat up high in the range, looking fairly positive. Volume was about average, which is pretty strong for a shortened trading week. I would expect an early test for supply next week. And if supply is found to be low, and it may well be, a push up to the highs of the range is pretty likely next week. If supply continues to be drawn out, we'll probably just get a deeper test for supply and look more like that by the end of the week. But I'm thinking that supply is probably going to be modest next week, that selling pressure will be relatively low, and that'll allow the market, following its test for supply, to push up to the highs of the range. This is consumer discretionary, and it showed a little bit of strength, or at least shortening of the thrust more recently. And there was some strength seen in this bar. It was only modest. The market's traded within that bar's range this week. It did test for supply below the previous bar's close. It didn't push higher than its high. It just traded within its range to close adjacent to the previous bar's close by the end of the week. Volume was reduced, but almost average. This market's not looking particularly strong. It's attempting to find some support and consolidate sideways, and it's a watch at best. The breakdown line's way up here, and this is all supply being drawn out down here. A little bit of shortening of the thrust. The market's now moving sideways, or attempting to. So while it's not looking strong, it's attempting to find some support. We'll see how that goes. This is the ASX property sector, and similar to the previous chart, it's attempting to find some support. Most of the market actually saw some strength emerge on this bar. This market didn't really, perhaps slightly, but not much. Here's the range. This market's attempting to consolidate in. I'm not sure it's going to be successful. There was a test of sorts below the previous bar's close early. Wasn't a particularly good test by the looks. There was a response higher and a fade lower to close mid-bar by the end of the week. A modest attempt to consolidate sideways at best. Not looking particularly strong, and we'll just keep watching this market and see if anything emerges as the weeks roll on. Just back to the parent index quickly. After seeing all those charts, you can see what this market's done. It's fairly clear. The modest strength was seen last week after trading below the lows of the range. The breakdown lines above, the market's attempting to consolidate in this zone here. Price pushed higher this week, didn't really issue a serious challenge to the breakdown line. It just faded lower to close about mid-bar and adjacent to the previous bar's high. I would expect a test for supply in this market next week, perhaps almost certainly a test for supply early. That's a modest pullback and then recovery, and then the market will respond depending on how much supply is drawn out. Okay, thanks for your time. Back again next week. See ya.